In 1307, England had a new king. Edward II was a robust young man in his early 20s, but from very early on in his reign, the prospects of a peaceful period were slim, and by and large, this was almost entirely Edward's own fault. One of his first acts as king was to recall his close friend Piers Gaveston from exile. Edward's father, King Edward I, had developed a deep mistrust of Piers, who he felt rightly held too much influence over his son. Edward I banished Piers from his kingdom, but on the old king's death in July 1307, Edward II was free to recall him. On Piers's return, he was made Earl of Cornwall, which had the approval of only some of the magnates, but went down like a lead balloon with others who clearly hated Piers. Piers, born in Gascony, acted almost like a second king, as he knew he held Edward's deep affection. What's more, Piers was tied closer to Edward II when the king married him to his niece, Margaret. Margaret was the daughter of Edward's sister, Joan of Acre, who had been born whilst Edward I and his queen Eleanor of Castile had been on crusade. Margaret's father was the now long dead Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester. To add to Piers's already massive ego, the king held a tournament in his honour at Wallingford on the 2nd of December 1307. Resentment of this foreign-born man from lowly origins continued to grow, but Piers could not care less. For a number of years, long before he became king, Edward had been betrothed to Isabella, daughter of the French king Philip IV. The arrangement had been made when Edward was 15 and Isabella only 3. An embassy had been sent to Philip's court to finalise the details, and Edward now prepared to cross the Channel to France. Acting as guardian of England in his absence would be Piers Gaveston. Edward and Isabella, who was now aged about 12, married in January 1308 before they returned to England, and attention now turned towards Edward and Isabella's coronation, which took place on the 25th of February 1308. At the coronation, Piers, dressed in purple, a colour usually reserved for royalty, made himself the centre of attention. As one chronicler put it, he carried in his filthy hands the crown and helped organise the celebration feast, and he cast a significant shadow over the young queen, who must have been bewildered enough already with the pomp and ceremony without having to compete for her husband's attention with the obnoxious Piers. Piers's behaviour caused widespread anger and mutterings of mutiny against the king and his favourite. Edward was in grave danger of losing the support of his nobility so early in his reign. He maintained the backing of Hugh Despenser, who, along with his son, would become increasingly controversial as the reign wore on, and the king's nephew, another Gilbert de Clare, who had succeeded his father as Earl of Gloucester, attempted to remain neutral. But as tensions rose, this would become more and more difficult. Even Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln, one-time friend of Piers, grew to hate him. Naive at times as he may be, even Edward had enough sense to realise that he needed to apply caution. He strengthened, repaired, and garrisoned his castles, whilst his nobles did the same with their strongholds. It seemed as though Edward II's England was readying itself for civil war. But this didn't need to be the case, and the nobles knew it. If only the king would rid himself of this despised Gaveston, then all could be well in the kingdom, and Edward, without needless distraction, could turn his focus towards governing the country. He was eventually persuaded to banish Piers from England. For the second time, Piers was to be exiled, which was arranged for the 24th of June, 1308. Edward accompanied his favourite to Bristol and watched on as Piers set sail for Ireland. It was clear, though, that Piers would return, and it's almost certain that Edward had already determined that in his mind. For his part, Piers himself would know that Edward was not ready to abandon him, and it was merely a matter of playing the waiting game. In Piers's absence, peace did not reign. Disharmony and division instead reigned, particularly amongst the nobility. Much to their annoyance, Piers continued to greatly enrich himself in Ireland with revenues that ought to have transferred to the English crown. Edward, for his part, saw an opportunity to divide the nobility with cunning and manipulation. He used bribery and gentle persuasion to win them over to his side. For the king, this was necessary, as, still so early in his reign, he had, through his own stupidity, allowed a situation to develop that threatened to pit the entire nobility against him. He needed to put a stop to that immediately. For the time being, he was successful, and most of the nobility were won over. Only Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, stood steadfast against the king, but for Edward this was good enough. The following year of 1309 saw the return in secret of Piers to England. He landed at Chester, where the overjoyed king came to meet him. Edward's attempts of divide and conquer had worked, and there was little dissent from his nobles regarding Piers's return. The likes of Henry de Lacy and John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, decided to set aside their differences. The chronicles hint that these men were fickle, which is perhaps harsh. For the sake of peace in England, which, as mentioned, had been teetering on the brink of civil war, giving Piers and the king a second chance would be preferable to arming themselves in readiness for battle. Civil war rarely did any good, and now it could only be hoped that Edward and Piers, the latter in particular, had been humbled enough to act in a more suitable and sensible manner. Unfortunately, any such hopes were quickly dashed. Piers had not been humbled at all. Instead, he created insulting nicknames for his enemies. He referred to de Lacy as Burstbelly. The Earl of Warwick was known as the Black Dog of Arden, and Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, was the Fiddler, among others. Any chance of reconciliation between the nobles and Piers were literally made impossible because of the latter's astonishing attitude and arrogance. Enmity grew, particularly with the Earl of Lancaster, who, thanks to Piers's interventions with the king, saw his influence rapidly diminish. However, this had very little impact on the king, who celebrated Christmas with Gaveston at St Albans in Hertfordshire, with Edward in particular high spirits. However, once the festive season was over, Edward could not continue to run away from his growing problems. The king called Parliament in January of 1310, but found very few nobles responded. They made it clear to Edward that whilst Piers remained in his presence, then they would abstain from meeting the king. Were it absolutely necessary for them to attend Parliament, then they would arrive heavily armed. Realizing he couldn't ignore these warnings any further, Edward sent Piers away into hiding for a time, whilst he held tense discussions with his nobles. It was put to the king that a council of advisers to help him govern should be appointed. These would be known as ordainers. Unsurprisingly, the proposal was met with reluctance from Edward, who tried his best to delay giving a proper answer. But when he was threatened with deposition, he found himself with little option. 21 ordainers were elected. Among them included Robert Winchelsea, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Earls of Lancaster and Gloucester. Shortly after this, Edward decided to launch a surprise campaign in Scotland and ordered his nobles to meet him at Berwick upon Tweed. It's possible that this was a petulant act of defiance on the king's part and an attempt to show that he was still the true power in England. If so, many of the nobles were happy to prove otherwise and ignored his call. Only the Earls of Gloucester and Surrey, from the most powerful nobles, heeded the call. Another possibility was that Edward's campaign was him trying to dodge a summons from his father-in-law, King Philip IV of France, who wanted him to pay homage for his lands in France, Gascony and Ponthieu. Whatever the cause for Edward's trip northwards, it was entirely pointless. Robert the Bruce avoided any form of confrontation with Edward, and all he managed to achieve was to restock his Scottish castles. In the summer of 1311, the Ordainers arrived in London with a list of demands that would keep in check Edward's power. The king had no choice but to leave Scotland and face the music. The list of demands included holding Parliament at least once a year. Appointments made by the king were to be made only after the approval of Parliament, and in reference to Edward's recent and dismal campaign, the king was not allowed to go to war without the consent of the nobility. These were known as the ordinances. The one ordinance that upset Edward the most, unquestionably, was the one that demanded Piers Gaveston yet again be sent, this time permanently, into exile. Edward was even willing to grant all the other ordinances without delay if the nobles allowed Piers to stay in England. Edward's pleas eventually turned to threats when he saw that the nobles had remained unmoved. Eventually, Edward saw the game was up and put his seal on the ordinances. Piers was sent into exile in November 1311, travelling to Flanders in secret. But this third and final exile of Gaveston did not last long. The king's temper, teetering on the edge already, was pushed past its limits when it was proposed that all of Pierce's friends and allies be sent away from the royal court, lest they suggest to the king the idea of recalling Pierce. At this, Edward was irate, and he immediately ordered Piers to return to England. But it seems even Piers feared that this may not be sensible. He heeded the call, but attempted to keep a low profile. However, the nobles soon became aware that Piers had indeed returned, and a meeting between them and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Winchelsea, was held. Winchelsea excommunicated Piers, and the nobles, led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, now made plans to arrest Gaveston. Thomas marched northwards to Newcastle, where he seized weapons and horses that had been given to Gaveston by the king. Thomas then got word that Gaveston was holed up at Scarborough, some distance away from the king's protection. Thomas positioned himself so that the king could not come to Pierce's rescue, whilst the other nobles laid siege to Scarborough Castle. For Gaveston, the fast and loose game that he had been playing since the days of Edward I were nearly up. He eventually surrendered to the Earl of Pembroke, Emir de Valence, who sent him to a little village named Dedington. On hearing this, the Earl of Warwick made straight for Piers, arriving in Dedington on the 10th of June 1312. Warwick, calling out in the early morning air, ordered Gaveston to arise and meet his fate. The possibility of sending Gaveston to a traitor's death, i.e., having him hanged, drawn, and quartered, was discussed, but in the end, a mere beheading was decided upon. Gaveston was handed over to the Earl of Lancaster, pleading desperately for his life. His tears had little effect, and he was taken to Black Hill, where two Welshmen in the employ of Lancaster were ordered to kill him. One ran Piers through with his sword, before the other cut off his head. Some local friars gathered Pierce's body, sewed back on his head, and took him to Oxford for burial. When he heard Piers had been executed, Edward said, "By God's soul, he acted as a fool," but these were the words of a grief-stricken man. Edward had loved Piers like a brother, and this was a tremendous blow to him. Edward called Parliament, and again many of the nobles arrived heavily armed, and some, including Lancaster, unsurprisingly given his role in Pierce's death, arrived with a small army to back them up. As turbulent as 1312 had proved to be for the king, however, There was some good news in November of that year. His young queen Isabella had given birth to a baby boy named Edward at Windsor Castle. The birth of an heir was vitally important for kings in the Middle Ages, but for Edward II it was especially important. He had been threatened with deposition before he had barely accomplished anything as king, and as time had gone on, the threat of Edward losing his crown had only increased. Later in the century, in 1399, Henry Bolingbroke deposed his childless cousin, Richard II, and took the crown for himself. But with the birth of this little baby boy, Edward II's throne had become a little more secure.